Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage Method Space. And I'm excited today to have an opportunity to talk about how to analyze online talk, because boy, we sure have a lot of online talk these days. And I'm joined today by Trena, Paulus, and Alyssa Wise, who've written a book on this topic that they will share with you. But first, if you would go to the next slide, if you're new to Method Space, just want to welcome you. This is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publications, and we're interested in all things to do with planning, designing, conducting research, writing about it, sharing results in conventional and new ways. And at the heart of that, teaching and learning, because we're all learning new things, you know, whether you're a student researcher starting from the beginning or an experienced researcher who wants to learn some new approaches. So we hope you'll visit methodspace.com to find out, you know, more posts and additional kinds of interviews. But today, to start with, why don't you introduce yourselves, Trena and Alyssa?
Hi, I'm Trena Paulus, and I am right now in Johnson City, Tennessee. I'm a professor and director of undergraduate research and creative activities at East Tennessee State University, and I'm housed in the research division in the Quillen College of Medicine here.
Thank you.
And I'm Alyssa Wise. I'm in New York City. I'm at NYU, where I'm an associate professor of educational technology and learning sciences. And I direct NYU Learn, which is the learning analytics research network devoted to using data science methods to better understand and support learning in its many forms.
Well, great. So as mentioned, you've written a book about analyzing online talk. So maybe you could just start by describing your motivations for writing this book and give us a little backstory.
Yeah, so I'll kick us off here. So Alyssa and I actually overlapped in graduate school at Indiana University many years ago. We were both in instructional design and technology and learning sciences area in the School of Education. And then we kept in touch professionally because back then was when online discussions and online talk was really just getting started in an educational context. And we were both really interested in that for our dissertations. And then a few years ago, Alyssa got invited to write a book, an encyclopedia chapter. And since I take qualitative approaches and she takes more quantitative computational approaches, she asked me to co-author that with her. And then after that, I talked her into maybe possibly considering expanding it into a book, which she was happy to do eventually because she's a very busy person. So I was happy to convince her to do that. And Alyssa, I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about like why you felt also that a book on this topic was important based on our experiences as faculty.
I mean, I think you're laughing because I think we both felt the need for this book for many, many years before we wrote it, because there's lots of information about how to do research generally, but when it comes to looking at online talk, there's just a lot of really specific things you need to know. And I think there was two things that really brought us to this. One, the fact that we were constantly feeling like we had to reinvent the wheel for all of our students. Every time a student wanted to go look at online talk, you know, we had lots of resources and things we'd compiled that we gave to them, but there wasn't one thing we could say, here's a place to start and give you a comprehensive picture. So it always felt a little bit like they were putting together a jigsaw puzzle and we were just constantly handing them the pieces. And by writing a book, I think it gave us a chance to synthesize the different jigsaw puzzle pieces and put them together so that we would be handing students something where they could see the big picture while exploring the little bit. So I think that was one of the big motivations. And then the other one was that even though, you know, Trena comes from and works in a tradition of qualitative research and discourse analysis, and I have a much more quantitative orientation with my work in data mining, I think we actually see very eye to eye on some of the fundamental questions you need to ask. I was almost going to say fundamental assumptions, but it's not that we necessarily share the assumptions, but we share an understanding of what the assumptions are and what the questions are, so that if we're doing something different, we can both recognize what each of us are doing differently and apply different standards. And I think a lot of people just don't have that conversation. They're sort of stuck in their boxes. And I think both of us could see across the boxes and say, even though we're operating in really different paradigms, we can speak the same language, which means that this is one of the few books out there, I think, that talks about research from qualitative and quantitative perspectives in a dialogue. And it's not about mixed methods research, it's just about how do you take the higher level picture that brings both of them together so you can even make the right choice about which one is going to help you answer the questions you care about.
Right. Well, I really want to just emphasize one of the points that you started out with, and because even though scholarship is, certainly increasing about, all kinds of online studies, it's one of the challenges is that, we don't have a common language. So what's digital methods versus virtual methods versus online methods? And it makes it very difficult when you're trying to communicate to, a student or a novice researcher, who wants to think about how to proceed and what would work best for them. And when we look at research articles, we can see maybe what they found out, but not like how did they get there, and what what mistakes did they find along the way that they learned from. And to me, that's where books are extremely valuable. And in these interviews, I often will ask people, maybe this is something we can talk about later or you can weave into your presentation. It's not only about using it as a textbook in a class. It's about, continuing to learn and be able to actually, dig into the methodology. And so, that's why I wanted to start with the question of asking you to talk about the ways that you defined your terms and the framework, which I found very useful in the beginning part of your book.
Thanks for that question, Janet. Let me go ahead and pull up a slide that shows the framework, because I think that would help people who are watching follow along. And I guess I'll start with the top of it and sort of one piece, and then maybe hand off to Trena, and we can go back and forth a little bit. And I think if there's one thing that we try to do in the book, and this diagram kind of captures it. This diagram is at the start of every chapter, and you can imagine each chapter is one or two, or in some cases three, I think, of these bubbles. And the theme that we follow is that it's the most important thing is that your bubbles are aligned. The most important thing is that the decisions you make in one part of your study follow through to the next. Right. So while we'll talk about each of the pieces, the most important thing is the thread between them. In other words, that your research design is set up to ask questions that you can answer in particular ways about your object of interest to speak back to the literature and the theory. So that's kind of pulls it all together. And the thing that we start with usually is the object of interest. What is it you want to study? And that sounds like an obvious question, right? You're going to do research, you know it's going to be about something, but it turns out that a lot of times people aren't always as clear as they think they are. So for example, in a study of online talk, and we have an example we'll show in a little bit about a Facebook group, people might say, well, I want to study this Facebook group. But are you thinking of this Facebook group as this really interesting phenomenon of people coming together during COVID? Or are you just interested in how people talk in social media? Are you interested in it because someone gave you this data set and you're trying to find something? Or are you interested because there's a theory of how people engage in collective action and you want to test it out? And so all of these things, is there a particular phenomenon you're looking at? Are you looking at sort of social mobilization? Are you looking at support? Are you looking at collective action? Or maybe you're really just interested in who connects to who. All of these actually lead to really different designs. And so being able to articulate at the start what is really the object, and object is obviously not necessarily a physical thing that you're interested in, is quite important. So that's one of the things that we start off with, saying, here's a whole chapter devoted to helping you think through and clarify for yourself what really is it you want to look at.
Right. And I just, jump in there. And, Trena knows this because she's familiar with my work. In mine, I also, emphasize the importance of the kind of interconnected aspects of a design, which to me, when you're dealing with technology, it's, in other words, it's true for any research, but it is more true when you inject the technology into it. And so, I think that question about defining the object, part of it is, well, are you interested in the technology itself? Are you interested in the features and how they work and their design and whether people post pictures or text, or who, you know, are you interested in the features of the technology, or are you interested in the experience of the people who are coming to this group because they need, you know, support for about, you know, their cancer treatment or parenting toddlers, or, you know, whatever it may be. So trying to define that and what place the technology has in that question, you know, that, you know, seems to me, you know, an important piece that would help the researchers then go through to the other parts of the model.
Yeah, very, very much so. Thanks for pulling that out, Janet, because it is really critical as to whether the technology is sort of in the foreground or the background of what you want to do.
Right.
Yeah, and the, you know, another, in terms of defining terms, you know, object of interest is an important one. And then also just the underlying assumptions, which is something that a lot of people don't think about, is that when you're going into a research study, whether you're interested in an object that's an individual construct versus a group construct can become really important when you're looking at talk. And what language is, assumptions of what language is and how it functions is really important, because there's a difference, and some of it gets, we had great conversations in this book, because there's a lot of philosophical issues around language as representing something that's in the head versus language as a social action that's constructing something visibly through talk. And then how do you design a study that captures one of the other or both? And just the kind of knowledge claims, assumptions about, are you looking for generalizable knowledge, in which case you probably want a quantitative design, or are you really just interested in a deep understanding of the local context, in which qualitative would be appropriate? So we really try to hit those things early on in the book and define some of those terms that if you wait until too long in the study, you won't have that methodological alignment that Alyssa mentioned is so important for a quality outcome of a study. So those are a couple examples of the terms and how we really tried to focus on those as a somewhat unique contribution to online talk design.
So, you know, maybe you could move down the framework a little bit and talk about the kind of methodological implications or options and recommendations you might have.
Yeah, so I don't know if this would be a good time to maybe look at a couple of the examples that we wanted to kind of use to contextualize how we would think about the different design decisions that need to be made. So let's see, I guess we could look at or think about how we might methodologically engage with the Facebook group. There was a Facebook group that Alyssa used as an example in her class. That's a publicly available group, and it is about crafters for COVID. I believe that's what it's called. Because we could just take a look at that maybe really quickly. And so, you know, there's lots of different decisions that need to be made in terms of how you approach this as a data source. And I think what I'll just start with is we had talked earlier about the ethics of, you know, how do you know when to treat data, online data, as a data source? Because there's a lot of these groups out there and people are familiar with Facebook and other contexts, but just because the data is there or the online group is there doesn't necessarily mean that it's fair game for treating it as a data source. And so, you know, one of the first things I would do is, you know, look at the about this group description, just to kind of get a sense of the fact that it's public, and you can see right here that it's anyone who can see anybody can see who's in the group and what they post. Anybody can find this group. Sometimes ethics boards or your own ethical stance may make it more open to serving as a data source than not, because it's not locked down behind a login screen. So that's one of the big considerations. if you could not even see this group unless you had joined it, you were logged in, then it's not probably fair game for research, because the people in that group don't expect researchers to be in there because they're kind of behind a protective barrier of the login and joining the group. And you'd want to also look at, so there's 2,601 members. It's very active. People are still posting months later. This of course was created as a group since COVID. Looks like there's an average of at least one post a day. So you want to look at how active the group is. And one of the issues with Facebook and some of the proprietary social media sources in terms of ethics is that these are proprietary commercial endeavors, and they may have prohibitions against using it as research in their terms of service or their privacy policy, which tend to change on a regular basis. So if I even tried to say today what the rules are, they might be different next week with the next update. So it's important to kind of think through some of these things in terms of, and I'll let Alyssa talk a little bit more about a different kind of, we would call this naturally occurring data, because this is here, or pre-existing data. It's here whether we're here or not, but we have less control over it. And ethically, it's more dicey to treat it as a data source without some thinking about public versus private, how sensitive the topics are, which, they're talking about crafting and making masks. So it's not super sensitive, except that everybody is really sensitive right now because of COVID, making everybody vulnerable. Whether or not you're planning on interacting, are you planning on contacting, posting, or getting involved yourself? If you are, you're probably going to need to get informed consent. How vulnerable are the people who are posting on this site? So you can see here, this is from McKee and Porter, who wrote a really good ethics book some years back. How likely or not likely is it that you're going to need informed consent? And so there's never any right or wrong answer, but there's definitely a continuum of some of the issues around that.
Yeah. And I would just add on.
You also suggest, with the example that you showed where it had the moderators, do you suggest that people contact, if there are group moderators, and discuss the research with them?
Absolutely. With Facebook, I would, because those people are there as themselves. Even though it's an open group, in Facebook, you are yourself on Facebook. You're rarely there under a pseudonym. That's always a great idea, is to talk the idea over with the moderator, because especially from qualitative research, doing research with people and with groups is better than doing research on them. And so if you can get them on board and actually maybe ask some research questions that they would be interested in you studying, that would be great. Alyssa, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I was just going to make the distinction between sort of informed consent of every individual who you're considering part of the study and what Janet just brought up about talking to the moderators. So, when it's possible, it's always a good idea to talk to the people who are sort of in charge or responsible for the community, because you could imagine if you're in this community and while it's public, you still have a sense that it's your community, and someday you go and read an article in a journal or a newspaper article about that journal and you see yourself in it, you could actually feel a sense of violation. Whereas if the moderators sort of give their blessing, or they might put a public announcement saying, hey, people are going to be looking at this. If there's anything you don't want, you might want to think about removing it now, and giving people the option. That would be a way of engaging ethically with the community, but not necessarily gaining informed consent, where each person, all the 2,600 people who are involved have to sign something saying it's okay. In contrast, a lot of the situations I work in are sort of in online education, and they're on the opposite end of the continuum, where they're quite private, right? When we run an online course, you think no one but the people in the course are there. The topic sensitivity can depend on the topic of the course, but often, you might be in there interacting, and students, there is a power dynamic. So there is a sense of vulnerability. So I would say in that case, it's not just enough to talk to the instructor and say, oh, may I have data, but you would want to talk to each person in the course. And of course, it really changes with technology, because you would be very hard pressed to get a record of every comment someone makes in a face-to-face classroom without it sort of being obvious you're doing that, right? You'd be in the classroom with a tape recorder, so people would know it's happening. But when we interact online, whether it's through Zoom and Zoom is recorded, or whether it's through an LMS discussion forum, it is entirely possible for someone to go in and have access to the back end of the system and take the data out without the people who do it, who put the data in there, who commented, ever knowing that they're being observed. And just because it's possible doesn't mean it's okay. And, you know, even if it is anonymized. And so those are really big questions, especially in the field of learning analytics. And it's very different if we're talking about data that we're talking about here, which is online talk, which are my own words, versus a clickstream record of which parts of the LMS I clicked in. And so there's a sort of sensitivity of the data to consider as well.
Yeah, so we often find ourselves, you know, these ethical issues, like just whether or not your data source of interest is even ethically okay to engage with is often like one of the very first issues, and it's actually at the center of that bottom half of our process here, because it is a huge thing. And that's, I would say that's what I get asked the most when people find out this is the area that I work in is, well, can I look at this as data, and how do we get it through IRB?
Right. And in the first section of the book where you were talking about the I mean, say, you know, if you're looking at the posts that people have made versus what I would call eliciting data, where you are, you know, you're creating a situation where we're now going to talk about. So rather than observing the online class, you're, you know, interviewing students who've been in the class, who ask them, you know, what they're learning or how it's going. And, you know, so, I mean, on one hand, once you start asking questions, then you know that you're going to need consent. So it's a little bit more black and white. But you know, maybe you could talk a little bit about, you know, kind of some of those differentiations between the different kinds of talk that researchers can study.
Yeah, so you know, we make the distinction between, so we have not in this book so much talked about the elicited data, like from your typology of the elicited, enacted, and extant. And we do, although we do talk about, depending on the research design, you might pull in other types of data, because it's true that not every study is going to just be looking at online talk. It could be one of many sources of data. But the main distinction was really between the pre-existing, and we had a long conversation about what to call these types, because in my earlier work, I called it naturally occurring and researcher generated. And then Alyssa pointed out that there really is no such thing as naturally occurring, because even naturally occurring data has a researcher influence of some sort if you're starting to treat, or like do you want to say more about that, Alyssa? Or even the system itself, right?
Yeah, so when you talked about naturally occurring, my rebuttal or argument was nothing is naturally occurring, because naturally occurring assumes that you're in some vacuum, I don't know, maybe in outer space. And it's not that the researcher influenced it, but very often when we're interacting in technology, there's all these different decisions, perhaps made by the creators of the technology itself, that influence how we interact, that they may seem invisible, but they're not. And you can just think at the face value, you know, we all know that we write different kinds of messages in email, in Facebook, in Twitter, in Instagram, etc. And some of that has to do with social norms, but actually a lot of it has to do with the technological norms. So what we have here is an updated typology, and this is something that Susan Herring put out as a typology for computer-mediated communication quite a few years ago, that we felt was still valuable, but in fact things have changed. And so this is a typology that we suggest everybody take stock of the tools in which the talk you're studying occurs, and try to understand to what extent some of these might be things you want to look at as objects of interest, and to what extent, if they're not objects of interest, you need to account for them. And so, for example, like synchronicity, which used to be this strict, you know, is it synchronous or asynchronous, has really changed. And, you know, Facebook chat is a perfect example of that, because you might be going back and forth in quick succession having a synchronous conversation, or you might leave a message that somebody sees later. And so then there's this sort of question of what's the expectation of time lag between responses. And so if you're starting to look and you sort of see that responses are happening very quickly, that might be factor of the community and people care about the topic, but it might be a factor of the technology. Similar with persistence, you know, our expectations of whether something's going to be around might change what we say in it. And that's true, you know, knowing this Zoom is being recorded. it's one reason that Snapchat was such an innovation, because Snapchat's their entire model was it's not persistent, right? It's something that will disappear, and that's going to change how we talk. So when you talk about the extent that people sort of reveal themselves and talk, or people being bold, that obviously has quite a bit to do with those features. And you know, there's different ones, the extent to which our identity as individuals or as a community are apparent in our comments. You know, when you think about the different forums out there, for example, you know, from places like Twitter to Reddit, ones that allow for pseudonyms and anonymity versus ones like, as Trena was mentioning, where Facebook works very, very hard to make sure it's really you, assuming that there is only one you, versus places like 4chan that are quite fine with it not being you at all. And it goes on and on with how the messages are stored and displayed. And so trying to interrogate these really tells you a lot about the talk before you even look at the words themselves.
Yeah. It's a lot of things to think about. So, you know, maybe you could just, you know, walk us through kind of an analytic process with one of your examples. And
yeah, so you know, if let's say that we were okay and decided that we were going to get in touch with the moderator, and the moderator loved the idea of us doing a research study of the discussion posts to this Facebook group, and you know, they took whatever steps they needed to take. That and I would, for example, decide, you know, not to likely would not interact with the people themselves. If that's because you know, as a methodologist, I'm always coming from sort of a epistemological stance of I'm interested in, the reason I'm interested in online talk is I like to see what kind of world the visible language is making possible. That, you know, we all see what's happening in these online conversations. Everybody has access to it. We're all coming at it with a different lens maybe, but there's no question necessarily about what people are thinking behind the scenes, because you just treat the visible online talk as the source of data. So you know, I might decide, and in fact, one of the decisions that you have to make is to bound, because there's thousands of posts at this point. So how are you going to do the bounding? And so that's another term that we define in the book. You can either bind it by platform, people, topic, or time. And so we know that there's a lot of conversations going on outside of the Facebook group, because they talk about email. They might have private chats to each other, telephone, maybe even in-person meetings when they're dropping off masking supplies. But we're going to bound it. We only want to look at what's happening in the visible Facebook discussions. We want to look at, we're not going to limit it by people necessarily, although we could decide just to look at the Facebook facilitate, like there's definite moderators in this group that you would learn if you spent time with it, which the very first thing you would do is spend a lot of time sort of as a qualitative researcher reading through and seeing, and it's like right here, we can see there are certain admins and moderators, and you might just decide to look at them, or you might be looking at all of the members. Probably I would bind it by time, because I would probably just look at the most recent posts to get a sense of what's going on. And the topic would be an open question for me as a discourse analysis or a language-based researcher, just wanting to actually see what topics emerged from the data. So you have to think about how you're going to limit it. And let's say I just want to look at the past month as a starting point, and then I might add more data from there. And it's always a very exciting process, because you don't necessarily know what you're going to get until you get in there and see sort of what's happening. And let's see, there was the other interesting thing, if you scroll down to see the group rules, is this can give you some idea of the situational characteristics. So Alyssa talked a little bit about the technological characteristics of a platform, but it's also good to know what the social norms are. Who's talking? What are their characteristics? Why are they talking to each other? What are they talking about? You know, what is their topic? What are the activities? And what are the norms? So it's really cool when you actually see some norms in a site like this, to understand, like, okay, you know, keep on topic. They don't want a lot of off-topic talk. This is what the topic is. Be kind and patient. You know, this is what's super fascinating to me about this in terms of the version of the world that it's constructing. Nobody would have understood anything about what's going on in this site 6 months ago. We would be like, COVID what? Masks? challenging and confusing times. What's going on in the world? So you can see by some of the choices that they're making, even with the rules, being kind and patient, that we know what we mean by challenging and confusing times. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but we wouldn't have known 6 months ago what they're even talking about. So one of the first steps in the process is kind of just getting this overall sense of documenting the technological characteristics, which a lot of us are familiar with if we're Facebook users, in terms of how it's set up. But if you weren't, you'd have to spend a lot of time understanding how Facebook works. And then just the situational characteristics of this particular public group, talk to the moderator, get their permission, and then start really digging into some of the posts themselves to see what that might tell me in terms of doing a discourse analysis. Alyssa, I don't know if you want to jump in and add anything in terms of what maybe you notice as well from your perspective, or how you might approach it.
Yeah, what I thought I might do, Trina, is just contrast a little bit with the ways I might approach it differently. So some of the things are similar. Like I would also notice, you need to live in this Seattle metro area, but not Puget Sound Islands. And as someone who lived over there, I know what that means. It's a different area. But you can see here they also talk about, due to the timeliness of our local demand, we can't focus on non-local, like really large, or personal goals. So they're actually constructing like a very specific, group level kind of construct of what they're trying to do here. And so I guess what I would say, and I'm going to flip back to the PowerPoint just for 1 second, that might be a little bit different is, you were on the assumptions sort of talking about this group object, your language is how they construct it together, and you're making very particular knowledge claims about this group. And I think your object of interest was a lot about the how, right? How is it going on? And it's interesting to you because it's this very interesting practice that arose in the last 6 months.
Yep.
In contrast, and I'm going to, maybe typify a quantitative perspective more than I always do in my own research, I might be a lot more interested, if I'm going to take a different perspective, I might be interested in individuals, and I might be interested in languages just representing what's going on. Because we're only looking at one case, I probably would also not be trying to generalize more broadly than this, but my questions might revolve around sort of who is involved, how much people are involved, questions about the participation structure. Is it, we both looked through this group and it's very clear that there's one woman who is very active. Is it, with one woman driving everything, with, other administrators stepping up and other people coming in as they will, or is there a core tight group of people involved, and trying to understand that structure? I also might be interested in what kinds of interactions are people engaging in. They say it's not about sharing materials and this and that, but maybe that is or isn't true. So I would also try and, find out those things. And I might also, from a sort of quantitative deductive perspective, try to bring in a bit more theory by going to the literature and seeing what's out there. So for example, there was a very cool study from a few years ago on craftivism, participation, and civic engagement, looking at Ravelry's Pussy Hat project. So if you remember, right around 2016, there was a movement where everyone was knitting these pink hats with the 2 little ears on them.
Yes.
And there was a lot of community engagement around that in Ravelry, which is a knitting site. And someone did a really cool study and looked at all the things that happened there. And they saw how people were not just making hats, but it was a forum for civic expression. People were providing practical support and socio-emotional support. So I might actually posit questions of, are the activities of civic expression, practical support, and socio-emotional support happening here as well? Are those features of this kind of group? The other thing that they noticed there was that group was heavily dominated by women, maybe because it was the craftivism. And I would be curious to see, is that the same case here, not just in terms of the number of participants being women versus men, but also the different roles people take in terms of leadership and how people position themselves. So it might be a very different set of questions, but I would still be using the framework to help develop them.
Yeah.
So one of the, just kind of terminology points that I'd like you to, talk a little bit more about is that the term of bounding. I think about say in case study methodology where we talk about bounding the case, and then on the other side we talk about sampling, and in qualitative we have purposeful sample, probability sample, different kinds of samples. It seems like when you're describing about bounding, within a study of a site like this or a group like this, using the term bounding in some ways kind of overlaps with sampling.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, I think of bounding as sort of the overall, in this case, bounding the data set. Which in this case, it is a case study, so there's a lot of overlap. But unlike Trena, who said she'd look at the most recent, you know, as a quantitative researcher who's got some natural language processing tools I could run on all of it, this group's only been around 6 months. I don't know exactly how much that is, but it's probably more, certainly enough data that we could handle it. It's not going to be too much. It's only been around 6 months. So I probably would bound by platform, like Trena did, but I would say all people and all time periods and all topics are included. But I might, if I'm going to start coding things, for example, if I want to know, is there civic expression? I don't have an algorithm for that, so that probably would involve human coding. So then I probably would want to do some sampling. But how I sample is an interesting question, because in online space, we have actually quite a bit of tools. So you can see, you know, we certainly got date methods. Like I could say, okay, I want to sample across time. I might want to sample across people, making sure I'm getting from both the very active people and the less active people. And then we have all of this paradata. So without me making a like icon, you can see that this was liked by 7 people and received 19 comments. So I could start to extract that data and use the sort of popularity of a post, the conversation around it, as a way to potentially decide what to do. How to analyze it. And from my perspective, I might not be analyzing a post as a standalone, but I also might be analyzing a post with a discussion that follows it as a thread, as a single unit. That's another decision that you have to make, is do we look at these comments individually and code each of them separately, or are we coding them as a block together? And then I guess the one last thing that we have to be careful of is, because the way that Facebook and any social media tool shows things, it shows things based on who you're already friends with. It shows things based on what's already received attention. So just because something has a lot of comments doesn't actually mean it was more important to people. It might mean that it got a like early on and then got promoted. Or it might be that posts by people who are well connected get more attention. So you have to be very careful about the direction of your implications, because we don't always know all those inner workings. And so all of that becomes very important for sampling. And we're talking about sampling maybe perhaps both text and images, which would allow another dimension for us to think about.
And I'll just add that that's super important, because I think one of the reasons we were excited to write the book was to have the computational approaches like natural language processing, machine learning, quantitative methods that can deal with the large scale of social media data or just discussion posts that are out there, in conjunction with the closer qualitative analysis, because I really think that that's the future. If not, and actually the future is already here, really. It's just us in academia, or I am behind the times. That if you want to look at this type of data, you've got to be partnering with people who know these methods of taking a look at these huge data sources. Where do you find where the action is in intentional ways that then is worth your time, because it's very time consuming to do a qualitative analysis of these posts.
Right.
So don't waste your time doing a close analysis unless you know with some of these more powerful tools that this is actually where you need to be looking. And I don't see nearly enough discussion about this in the qualitative community. People are still acting like they've just discovered online talk, and that's going to happen now because of COVID, because so much is online, that they don't realize that we've been doing this since the 1990s, and we have some really powerful tools and methods, and that's why we kind of wanted to get it all in one place. And so, yeah, I think so, just to kind of reiterate and to support that, like, that's going to need to be the approach moving forward. As we kind of think through methods.
Right. Yeah, we had a focus on mixed methods a couple of months ago on method space, and had some very interesting resources, which I can link in with this post. But it almost seems like we need to go a step further. It's not only mixed methods, but really collaborative approaches, because you need deep expertise in, very different, kinds of areas. And, to me, just like, say, looking at trends and gigantic sets of data, it might be semi-interesting, but it'd be a lot more interesting if you then said, well, let's take the qualitative deep dive into, this part of it, and then, what those larger trends are going to have more interest or significance.
Well, and I would just say from the reverse perspective, Trena knows I agree heartily with everything she just said, but I would say I'm making the same argument on the other side. So we just had a paper at a conference recently talking about the importance of mixed methods data mining and saying that, yeah, it's great that you're running these big algorithms and topic modeling and social network analysis on these big data sets, but if all you're doing is interpreting that high level model without going back to the actual talk, there's a missing element of ground truth and richness. And we've just study and study again. Every time we end up with a big model and we go back and look at the talk that contributed to it, it tells us something more. And sometimes it shifts our understanding and sometimes it just reinforces it and deepens it. And so I'm sort of been making the call within the communities doing these big methods, these big data methods, to say, that's great, but that should be, the start, not the end. And so I do think it's a conversation where both sides need to come together.
Right, exactly. Learn from one another and figure out how to collaborate so that we can get a better picture. The one other area I wanted to ask you to talk about is, well, actually there are two areas that interest me. One is the use of images and media and how you bring those into a study of this kind. And then, so I'll let you speak a little bit about that and then.
Alyssa, do you do any of that image work?
We really haven't. And I actually think that, one of the things when we wrote this book, we started off by framing it online talk. And we say at the beginning, we're going to mostly focus on words because there's so many more methods for doing that. But when you think about imagery, it's, we know all of these platforms are becoming more and more visual. And we know that that's a huge way people are communicating. And so I would say that's actually an area in sort of desperate need of methodological innovation. And while there's certainly, computer vision techniques that can detect things, those are very far from anything that is going to really tell us something useful for research. And I don't know, from a qualitative perspective, I'm not familiar with lots of really robust frameworks for looking at imagery and making sense of it. And I think it's a real challenge, but it's one we're going to have to face if we're not otherwise going to be leaving out a huge part of the picture, part in the bum.
So yeah, so there is a growing body of work, and Janet, I know one of your areas is arts-based methods, and I think that this is sort of an area where you're going to see more work. In fact, I'm seeing more doctoral students wanting to look at Instagram and TikTok and video and image based because they're really interested in the data as a starting point. And then I do feel like we're lagging a little bit behind with synthesizing some of the really great arts-based methods that qualitative scholars are starting to come out with, and then applying those to social media images. Now, we do have a couple of vignettes in the other book that's coming out this year in digital tools of researchers using Instagram and talking about their ideas for doing that. But I know, like Alyssa said, when we wrote the book, we actually had to make a conscious decision not to go down the road of images because we felt like it was like a whole other thing. And so and plus our own experiences have been
you had
so
to bound it somehow.
We did. That's exactly. But it's definitely an area that needs more methodological innovation. I feel like all the pieces are out there, but I haven't seen anybody really pull it together yet.
Well, I guess, I mean, there's the image side of it, but there's also the spoken word of recordings and that kind of talk. So
video
is that something that you...
that one I can speak to a little bit because there's a lot of work being done in the analytics space on multimodal analytics, which tracks all of those things and produces various metrics. So we were just talking today, there's different analytics that can track, percentage of talk time in a Zoom conversation. It can look at ordering of turns of talk. It can also look at when someone is talking, are people, and this is now I'm moving into face-to-face collaboration, there's very small devices about this big you can put in the center of a table and you can see, when somebody is talking, are other people looking at them while they talk? So there's all of this, there's all of this happening and providing a lot of really detailed information, but then the big question is, what is that information useful for, right? We can get lots and lots of quantitative data, but we need to think, is Is it proper and right to be tracking who's paying attention to who? Do we have the right signals for attention, etc.?
Mm-hmm. So I'll just close by saying, is there anything else that you would like to share in terms of recommendations to readers, or, you know, kind of how this book might be used either in the classroom or for professional use?
I will say that we forgot to put a slide with the actual cover of the book in here. So it's called but we both have one on our desk, Looking
There
for
you
Insight,
go. Okay.
Transformation in Online Learning and Online Talk, Routledge 2019, Paulus and Wise. And I've been lucky enough to get to teach with it only once. I actually got to use it as a textbook, which was, and the students, you know, I mean, they might have been biased, but I feel like it was pretty user-friendly for students because we wrote it from our perspective of having taught, you know, for me, it's usually been special topics courses because this is a very specialized area, but taking some of my thinking and teaching materials.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we didn't necessarily write the book with a lot of instructional materials per se, but it did work. And we got, you know, I actually used a draft of it with my students at one point and got some feedback from them. So I think it can work really well as a textbook, but if you're not in an educational context, it's also relevant for you. We tried to make it applicable with lots of examples for business, for marketing, for philanthropy,
Mm-hmm.
because online talk is not just limited to education. I mean,
Right.
everybody's doing it now more than ever. So we really tried to ground a lot of our examples in non-education academia specific
Mm-hmm.
areas. Yeah, so
Right.
Alyssa, I don't know
Yeah,
if you want
I
to
could see, you know, people who are interested in evaluation, you know, how are people discussing um, our
Products.
theater group or our social service delivery, or, you know, other kinds of things that, you know, would fit with a more kind of the practical side of research, or just trying to understand what, you know, what's the repercussion for, you know, the work that we're trying to do, you know, how are people responding to it. So, you know, I think that I like to always, you know, point out the value of these kinds of books beyond the classroom. So, Alyssa, what else were you going to add?
Yeah.
Well, so I was just going to say, you know, what Trina brought up is there's always sort of the question of how are we talking, or how are people talking about us, both of which are important and valid. But what I was going to say is whether it's in a class or on your own, this book, it's not meant for you to sort of read in the abstract. It's meant for you, it's meant to be a guide to help you investigate online talk. So I don't know if it'll work if I show this there. Of course it won't, because I've got virtual background on,
There
but
you
it says design decisions. So we have boxes throughout the book
Right.
with design decisions. And so I guess what I would say is the most thing I would say is if you're going to read the book, you should be reading the book because there's some online talk you want to understand. This is going to sort of help you figure out how to do it, and it's going to reveal to you decisions that you didn't even realize you had to make. And so I think taking this book as a guide on your journey, because you're going to look at online talk, would give you a lot more value than sitting down to read it sort of in general. So that's, I think, what I would say is the sort of the use case. You know, I've been giving it, any student I have who's going to look at online talk, you know, is getting a copy of this and holding on to it like it's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or something.
Right. Well, thank you both. It's, I think, a very interesting and important topic, and I think there's a real value for that kind of practical, hands-on guide, you know, type of book. So I hope that the viewers from Method Space will find this useful. Any closing comments you'd like to add?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Hope people can feel free to reach out to us for any, you know, additional discussion or conversation or questions. But yeah, we're excited to get a chance to talk about it. And who knew when we finished this a year ago that we would be where we are in the world today, that even more people might find it useful. So.
Yep, I think Trina said it well.
So thank you for the opportunity, Janet.
Yeah.